Hey everyone, what's going on? So, my last video, I mentioned offhandedly my quick thoughts on doxing and being anonymous on the internet. And I thought, you know what, I have another 20 minutes or so before I have to get going, so why not just talk about it here? Now, I don't endorse doxing whatsoever. In fact, I condone it. It's a bad thing to do. But I don't consider it horrible. I don't think it's one of the worst things you could possibly do to someone. Because in the current age of the internet, no one is really anonymous. I mentioned this in my last video again, but it's a really good piece of rhetoric for this argument. There were some people on 4chan who found out the identity of some guy, some Antifa guy, who was whipping people in the head with a bike lock and a fucking sock. And they found out he was a professor at a university, and they found out who he was, his face, just by looking at his fucking eyes, right? Like, just his fucking eyes and his mask. So, if people can pull that off, man, really, the only thing that's keeping you anonymous is the fact that you're not noticed, So, in light of this, with this being the new reality, I think there's really two options you can take, if you boil it down enough. One is to never engage and just observe. Just watch things, don't comment on it. You watch people's Twitter feeds, but don't tweet at them. Read people's Facebook posts, but don't put your own thoughts out there. Turtle up. And I think if you really care about your anonymity, anonymity? I can never say that word. If you really care about being anonymous, excuse me, this is what you need to do. Because even putting yourself out there a little bit, you're leaving a trail, ultimately. And the only thing that's keeping you anonymous is that no one's really paying attention to you. It's not that they can't, it's just that they don't really have any interest, or there's no need to. Hang on a second. So yeah. So if you really want to stay anonymous, which I totally get, I get people who just want to, observe and not participate. That's what you should be doing. Just don't engage at all. Stick to your own little corner in the world. Hang on. But, yeah. You can do that. Or you can do what I do, which is just throw yourself out there. And the reason why I'm going to make this video is to kind of explain why I don't stay anonymous. I show my face. I've said my name before. I've mentioned that I live in New York. It's very easy to find out who I am. Because I think in the current age of this phase of the internet, since it is practically speaking impossible to truly be anonymous, you have to accept the fact that even if you're like me and you have like 5 subscribers, no one fucking cares what you have to say, you are a public figure to some extent, right? Like to a little bit of an extent, you are a public figure. And that puts you in the same boat that a lot of politicians and celebrities and news anchors and shit like that, a lot of the same position that they're in that a certain amount of privacy just isn't afforded to you anymore. People know who you are, and they're gonna ask you, and they're gonna find out if they want. So just kind of accept it. Now, I completely understand why people don't really want to go through with this, do that. Well, for the obvious reason, just for example, they don't want people who don't like what they have to say, particularly if it's a controversial or an unorthodox opinion. They don't want people contacting their employer with the intent of getting them fired. Just for example. But there's other things too. They don't want to have an awkward conversation with their mother about some edgy views they have. Because maybe the rest of their family's not all that interested in it, and they're just not going to understand at first. They want to avoid those, awkward dinner conversations, which I completely understand. But there's some advantages, I think, to being public with who you are, public with your identity on the internet. One of the big ones, I think, is that it provides a great social pressure for you to be honest, or not honest, but be thorough in your reasoning. Because if you make a mistake, there's a social consequence. You will have a bit of stigma, if for only a few minutes or a few moments until you realize your error. Because when you're anonymous and you don't leave a comment, or excuse me, when you're anonymous and you get something wrong, there's no pressure for you to double back around and realize, okay, what was it about this situation that led me to that minor failing? What can I do better to make sure that it doesn't happen again? You might sincerely correct yourself, but without that little bit of social pressure, I think generally most people won't really be that kind of self-critical or employ that level of self-criticism that I think is very, very useful. And I am speaking from my own experience. Ever since starting YouTube, even though I don't do it very often, I've noticed that I've become much more studious when looking up information. I've become much more mindful of making mistakes and trying to get the facts right. Because if I fuck up, you know who I am. And there's a little bit of shame attached to that, right? Like, nobody likes being wrong. So yeah, I am very much in support in certain instances of social pressure as a way to get good behavior and to improve yourself as a person. So yeah, it's not a very long video, but yeah, I just wanted to kind of maybe make you consider not being anonymous if you are, because like I said, A, it's kind of futile anyway. If you want to be anonymous, then just don't engage whatsoever, and B, there's some personal benefit to it. Now let me say this: I completely understand not wanting to be anonymous or wanting to stay anonymous, like I said, because you don't want to have your employer contacted. And I would like to put out a call to people who do not have dependents. Because if you're a parent or someone's relying on you to make income, I completely understand. Like, it's no shame whatsoever. But if you're like me, if you're young, no one's really counting on you to earn money, you should really strongly consider not, being in the shadows, so to speak. Actually putting your face out there, because, like I said, it makes you responsible, and it also, in a way, tells all of the social authoritarians out there who want to censor you, who believe in censorship, and who want to have discourse completely controlled, so that nothing actually important or out of or unorthodox gets said. It's a way of telling them to go fuck themselves. Because free speech, it's not just a phrase, it's not just a catchphrase. For me, at least, to me, it's a true, real principle. And it's more than that, actually. It's not just a principle, it's a process. It's a vital principle to have if you want to have a civilized society. And I do use the word civilized intentionally, because, a lot of people have said this. You can either shoot each other or you can talk to each other. And I don't think anyone without common sense would argue that it's better to shoot each other. Every war, to some extent, was a failure of human nature. It was a failure to reason, in my opinion, on some level. But, yeah, it tells them to go fuck themselves a little bit. So it's a principle, but it's also a process. It's a process because when you allow anything to be said and everything to be said, two things can happen. One, you avoid conflict or you avoid needless conflict. Sometimes conflict, not necessarily physical, but intellectual is necessary, absolutely. But you avoid physical conflict, things like bloodshed, because you allow as many different tools to be employed as a way of solving problems before they eventually get to the point where violence becomes inevitable. You give people as many tools as they can to solve problems. And also because, the free market of ideas, it's not just the free market of ideas because it's a catchy phrase. It is a free market itself, which is to say that, the best ideas do tend to float to the top. Because when you allow anything to be said, whenever someone tries to, pull off some bullshit or say something wrong and they're not willing to correct themselves, well, then they'll lose social credibility. Like I said, they'll get pulled down. And then the ideas and the observations with the most reason and evidence behind them will naturally rise to the top, as a result of the fact that there's no barrier to entry. No barrier to entry means that if you get something wrong, anyone can come around and correct you. So yeah, that's about all I got. I could probably go on a little bit more for this, but I have to get going. So, hope you guys are doing okay. Take care. Peace.